In a nameless shop near the rocks, a widow's needle holds her world together until a cruel accusation shreds her pride and a sealed letter reeks of debt, danger, and a name that should have stayed buried. Then a stranger steps from the mist, a stern merchant with polished boots and lonely eyes. One request, one spark, duty or desire,
Indeed,
survival
your skill
or
is
surrender.
evident, sir.
Some secrets drown, others rise with the tide. If you're ready, take my hand. This is where everything begins. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and answer this. What do you crave most in a period romance? Forbidden love, redemption, or a scandal that dares the whole city to watch? Sydney, New South Wales. The year of our Lord 1842. A city still damp with the salt of its convict past, where the wind off the harbour carried both the scent of opportunity and the stench of judgment. And in a narrow lane off Gloucester Street, nestled between the cobbled noise of horse carts and the shrill calls of market boys, stood a humble dressmaker's shop whose windows bore no name, only the faded promise of skilled hands and silent resilience. Inside, Margaret Fairchild bent over her work table, the needle trembling ever so slightly between her fingers. Her eyes, a sharp and intelligent hazel, narrowed against the failing light as she adjusted the hem of a cotton dress for the third time. The sun, heavy and golden, fell through the window in slanted beams that lit the dust in the air like a cathedral of ghosts. Outside, the world marched forward with ambition. Inside, she stitched against its indifference. The bell above the door rang with a sharp clatter, and in came Mrs. Beatrice Ellsworth, swathed in lilac silk and righteous indignation. "I paid for a finished gown, Miss Fairchild," the woman barked, clutching the dress to her chest as though it were a wounded child, "and instead, I find uneven hems and pleats stitched by drunken fingers." Margaret straightened slowly, hands still resting on the edge of the work table. Her voice remained soft, measured. "The hem was not touched since your last fitting, madam. I believe perhaps—" "You believe." The older woman's laugh was brittle. "I do not pay for beliefs. I pay for perfection." "But what can one expect from a widow with no name and no standing?" The words struck as intended. Margaret said nothing. She folded her hands before her, the skin near her knuckles raw from needlework, her nails clean but worn. The silence between them stretched, brittle and bitter. "You will fix it by tomorrow," Mrs. Ellsworth declared, sweeping from the room in a rustle of silk, her cane tapping indignantly behind her. The bell rang again. Only then did Margaret exhale, as though she had been holding her breath since the moment the woman entered. She did not cry. Tears had long since become a luxury she could no longer afford. That evening, as the first lamps flickered to life across Sydney's winding streets, Margaret climbed the narrow staircase to her attic room above the shop. The scent of mutton stew drifted up from the landlady's kitchen below, mingling with the faint sea breeze that rattled the window panes. Upon her small writing desk sat a sealed envelope. She paused. The parchment was thick, the wax seal bearing a crest she did not recognize at first, an anchor wrapped in thorned vines. When she opened it, the words inside were few, yet heavy. Outstanding debt under the estate of Edwin Fairchild, deceased. Final warning. Confiscation procedures to commence within 10 days. At the bottom, a signature she didn't see, only the stamp. B. Shipping Co. She set the letter down with deliberate calm, as though even that paper might crumble if handled too harshly. Outside, a lone gull cried in the distance, echoing through the alley like a warning. Moments later, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Tabitha Granger, her landlady, her shawl pulled tightly around her plump frame, her eyes sharp with concern. "I heard that blasted Ellsworth woman," she said without preamble, "and I see that look on your face. You got another one, didn't you?" Margaret nodded once. Mrs. Granger stepped inside, her cane clicking on the floorboards. "You've no family to turn to," she muttered, more to herself than to Margaret. "And that husband of yours left more shadows than pennies. Tabitha, don't say you'll manage." The older woman's tone softened. "You always say that, and it scares me more each time." Margaret looked to the window, where the oil lamps of the city burned like restless eyes. "I will not beg." Mrs. Granger sighed. "No, you won't, but maybe, just maybe, someone ought to fight for you for once." She left the room with a muttered curse about the cruelty of merchants and the idiocy of men. Margaret sat alone in the silence that followed, her hands clasped in her lap. The candle flickered, the letter remained on the table, untouched. Later that same night, long after the city had settled into its nocturnal hush and the fog had crept in from the sea, the bell above the dress shop rang once more. She descended the stairs quickly, expecting Mrs. Granger again, or worse, another creditor. But it was not a woman at the door. Nathaniel Kerrigan stood beneath the awning, tall and broad-shouldered, his frock coat untouched by the fog, his gloves dark and elegant. The light from the lamp above caught in his eyes, grey like tarnished silver. "I was told," he began without preamble, "that you are the only dressmaker in this city who can be trusted with precision under pressure." Margaret straightened her back, wiping her hands on the edge of her apron. "That depends on the pressure," she answered. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of salt air and wood smoke. In his hand, he carried a folded waistcoat of crimson brocade. "There's a dinner tomorrow with the governor." His voice was low, clipped. "This arrived from London in pieces. I need it restored by noon." He placed it on the table between them as though it were a truce. Margaret examined the garment. Her fingers brushed the fabric. Brocade, fine. Threading nearly invisible. The damage, subtle, but significant. She looked up to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. "I can do it," she said. "I assumed as much," he replied, stepping back. "My coachman will return at 11. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I don't like failure, Miss Fairchild, and I don't entertain excuses." Without waiting for her reply, he disappeared into the mist. Margaret stood alone, one hand resting on the brocade. He had not asked her price, he had not asked her name. But as the bell rang once more in the quiet, she knew with strange certainty something had begun. Something not yet named. Something neither thread nor ash could explain. Morning mist clung to the streets of Sydney like the hem of a widow's veil. It curled through alleyways and seeped into doorframes, softening the sound of carriage wheels and the footfalls of the city's restless ambition. The sky above was pale, the colour of old parchment, and the scent of the harbour drifted through the air, salt, coal, and the promise of change. Margaret Fairchild stood at the foot of Clarendon Terrace, where the city's elite perched like birds above the common street. In her arms she carried a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, inside which lay the restored waistcoat. Every stitch had been chosen with care, every thread pulled with reverence for the fabric's weight and the man who would wear it. Her gloves were thin with use, and the cold nipped at her fingertips as she looked up at the grand facade of number 7, the residence of Nathaniel Kerrigan. Tall columns framed the front, flanked by symmetrical windows trimmed in green shutters. The brass knocker on the door gleamed like a sunbeam against the grey of morning. Margaret hesitated only a moment before lifting her hand and letting the knocker fall. Its sound echoed like a judge's gavel, commanding the house to stir. It was not Nathaniel who answered, but a servant in a dark livery with narrowed eyes. "Deliveries at the tradesman's entrance," he muttered, already beginning to close the door. Before the wood could meet the frame, a voice came from within. "Let her in." The servant stopped, flinched, and opened the door wider. Margaret stepped inside, crossing the threshold into a world she had only seen from the pavement. The air inside was warm, perfumed with beeswax, pipe smoke, and a lingering scent of rosewood. The floors beneath her boots were polished to a gleam, the hallway flanked by oil paintings and gilt-framed mirrors that caught and scattered the morning light. Every detail spoke of old money and relentless order. Margaret stood still, her hands steady around the box. She felt the weight of every gaze, real or imagined, pressing against her back. Then he appeared. Nathaniel Kerrigan, descending the staircase in a navy frock coat, his cravat immaculately tied. His presence, even in silence, commanded the room. The light from the high window behind him traced the lines of his shoulders and the sharp angle of his jaw. "You're early," he said simply. Margaret offered a small nod, her voice even. "The piece was finished sooner than I anticipated. I wished to deliver it before the air grew heavy with fog." He stepped closer, eyes fixed on the box in her arms. "And is it as I asked?" She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing the silk lining, before revealing the waistcoat, now whole again. The brocade shimmered softly, the stitching invisible to the untrained eye. He did not smile, but something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "You have a surgeon's hands," he murmured. "No seamstress in this city could have done this." Margaret lowered her eyes, not out of submission, but to hide the tremor that his words stirred in her chest. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quiet. "Come," he said, turning. She hesitated. "Sir, I was told I overrule my staff." He did not look back. She followed him down a long corridor where carpets muffled her steps and chandeliers flickered gently above. They passed a tall window that looked out over the harbor, where ships bobbed like chess pieces waiting to be moved. At the end of the hall stood a door of dark mahogany. He opened it without ceremony. The room beyond was spacious, yet intimate, a sitting room framed by dark velvet drapes and lined with shelves of worn leather-bound books. In the corner stood a pianoforte, silent and immaculate, as though untouched for years, and above it a portrait. A woman seated at the very same pianoforte, her gown of pale blue muslin falling in gentle folds around her. She was lovely, fragile, almost translucent. Blonde hair swept back in elegant braids, green eyes filled with an expression that could only be described as wistful. Margaret's eyes lingered. Nathaniel noticed. "My wife," he said, his voice flat. Margaret turned toward him slowly, unsure if she was permitted to respond. "She died 3 years ago," he added. A long silence fell between them. "I'm sorry," she said softly. His gaze did not move from the painting. "She loved music. She would play in this room every evening, no matter how tired she was. Said it kept the house alive." Margaret could feel the grief in his voice, not raw, not violent, but heavy and settled, like dust on old furniture. "I used to believe she left her spirit here," he continued, "but now I wonder if the silence means she's taken it with her." Margaret's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the box. "The rooms we love most often echo our absence." He turned to look at her then, his eyes meeting hers in full for the first time. The intensity of his gaze stole her breath, not because of its coldness, but because of the quiet ache beneath it. A long moment passed. "You remind me of her in no way at all," he said finally. Margaret's lips parted in faint surprise. "I hadn't meant—" "That is not a flaw." He moved closer, his voice low. "You speak differently. You carry yourself like someone who has never asked for anything she did not earn." "I haven't." Their gazes held. A knock came at the door. Nathaniel blinked once, breaking the tension, and turned toward the sound. "Yes?" A maid entered and curtsied. "Sir, the coachman is ready for the dinner departure." Nathaniel gave a brief nod. The girl's eyes flicked to Margaret, then quickly away. As she turned to leave, Margaret stepped forward and closed the box. "I should go." "You delivered what you promised," he said. "I hope the city repays you with the same." She looked up, her voice steady. "The city repays in whispers and debts, Mr. Kerrigan. That is all." For the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, just the faint shadow of one. He walked her to the entryway himself, ignoring the puzzled glances from the footman. Outside, the mist had thickened into a pale veil that blurred the street and soaked the hem of her skirts. She stepped out into it with quiet dignity, the box clutched under her arm. Nathaniel remained at the doorway, watching her retreat. Margaret did not look back. When she returned to her shop, the door creaked open on quiet hinges. The lantern she had left burning still glowed on the counter. The silence wrapped around her like a shawl. She climbed the stairs to her room above, her limbs heavier now, though she could not say why. And then she saw it. Another envelope. Same weight. Same seal. B. Shipping Co. But this one was not placed neatly on the desk. It had been slipped under her door, torn slightly at the edge. As she picked it up, her fingers hesitated. A scent clung faintly to the paper. Cigar smoke, bitter and lingering. She opened it with care. This is your final notice. If restitution is not made, enforcement will proceed. No name, no address, only the mark. She turned toward the window, which now stood open a crack. The fog had entered her room, soft and cold. She closed the window gently and bolted it. Then, without a word, she sat down in the chair beside her bed and stared at the envelope in her lap. Outside, the city exhaled, harsh and distant. Inside, Margaret Fairchild sat very still, and the weight of being watched settled on her skin like frost. The fog had not lifted for 3 days. It lingered over Sydney like a veil of mourning, draping its damp hush over the rooftops and wrapping itself around chimneys and lampposts, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The streets glistened with residual mist, their edges blurred and softened, like memories too painful to recall with clarity. Margaret Fairchild moved through the morning quiet with purpose, the hem of her wool skirt dampened by the stones beneath her boots. In one hand, she carried a folded paper wrapped in oilskin, a list of silk orders for a wealthy client near King Street. In the other, she held the weight of uncertainty, invisible yet insistent. She had not slept well. The second letter, harsh, unsigned, reeking of cigar smoke and cold authority, had stirred something deeper than fear. It had awakened a part of her long buried beneath layers of silence and resignation. Anger. And though she carried herself as always, with grace, with modesty, with her chin held high, there was now in her step the quiet defiance of someone who had decided not to be erased. It was just past 8 when she returned to her shop. She unlocked the door, entered, and barely had time to hang her cloak before the bell rang behind her once more. A man stood at the threshold, not a messenger, not a delivery boy. Nathaniel Kerrigan. In the morning light, his dark coat looked almost black, his gloves the color of storm clouds. The cravat at his throat was a simple grey, knotted cleanly, without ornament. Yet even dressed plainly, he carried the bearing of a man born to command. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, stepping inside before she could answer. Margaret straightened. "I hadn't expected—" "I require a word," he interrupted gently, his tone measured but direct. "Privately." He looked around the shop, eyes skimming the bolts of fabric, the scattered pins, the half-finished bodice on the mannequin near the window. There was no one else present, but still Margaret moved to the door and turned the lock, her hands trembling only slightly. Nathaniel waited. She turned to him. "You may speak." "I came to thank you," he began, "for your discretion and your skill. The dinner was a success." The governor remarked on the waistcoat. "But that is not why I am here." Margaret folded her hands before her, eyes wary. "I have need of someone reliable," he continued, "someone who can handle urgent work without excuses. My household and my business affairs require garments regularly, repairs, fittings, creation from scratch. I would prefer to have one trusted hand rather than rely on the whims of a dozen less capable ones." He paused, watching her face. "I would like to retain your services on a permanent basis." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the fog. Margaret's heart fluttered against her ribs. She masked it well. "I see. You would be compensated generously," he added. "Regular payments, materials covered, private deliveries, discretion respected." She did not answer right away. Instead, she walked slowly to the work table and touched the unfinished bodice there, her fingers resting lightly on the pinned fabric. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Do you know what people will say, Mr. Kerrigan? He met her gaze. "I know what they've already said. They will say, 'I am your mistress.'" His jaw tensed, but he did not look away. "And are you?" he asked. Margaret blinked, startled, not by the boldness of the question, but by the utter lack of malice in it. "No," she said quietly. "Then let them speak." He turned to go, then paused once more near the door. "The offer remains. You may send your reply with my coachman." Then he was gone, the echo of the bell following him like a sigh. By noon, Margaret had written her answer, a single sentence, folded into a cream envelope. "I accept the position, with conditions to be discussed." She handed it to the coachman without a word. That afternoon, she dressed in her best day gown, a modest dove-grey muslin trimmed with white lace, and tied her bonnet beneath her chin with calm fingers. She had no intention of becoming gossip's prey, but she would not cower either. Let the world talk if it must. She had debts to pay, a trade to protect, and a life that refused to be extinguished. With her cloak drawn close against the wind, she made her way to a tea shop near Macquarie Place, where her delivery appointment was scheduled. The establishment was tidy and narrow, its walls lined with small gilt-framed portraits, and windows fogged with steam from the kitchen. As she waited near the front with her parcel, a voice emerged from the murmur of the afternoon crowd. "I confess, I am surprised to see you here." She turned. A man stood near the entrance, removing his gloves with deliberate care. Julian Blackthorne. He was the sort of man who smiled with his mouth and not his eyes, whose gaze never rested long enough to be trusted. His frock coat was a rich forest green, the waistcoat beneath patterned with golden vines. He looked precisely like a man who had never wanted for anything, and had always believed he deserved more. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Mr. Blackthorne?" He gestured to the empty seat across from hers. "May I?" She did not respond, but neither did she rise to leave. He took it as permission. "I've heard," he began, stirring the tea he hadn't yet ordered, "that your shop has gained quite the patron." She said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and almost gentle. "Must be very flattering, being noticed by a man like Kerrigan." Margaret's expression did not change. "Men like Nathaniel are often generous, but never aimless," he continued. "He does nothing without a price. You do know that, don't you?" "And what is it you think he wants?" she asked softly. Julian's smile widened. "Oh, Miss Fairchild," he said, "you're far too clever to ask a question you don't already fear the answer to." He tapped his fingers once on the edge of the table and rose to his feet. Before leaving, he added, almost as an afterthought, "It's a pity about your husband. Terrible loss. I still remember the day he drowned. No warning, no witnesses. Strange, isn't it?" Her breath caught, but she did not speak. "I suppose we're all at the mercy of tides, aren't we?" He tipped his hat, and then he was gone. That night, back at her shop, Margaret lit a single lamp and sat before the fire. She did not touch her sewing. She did not read. She only stared at the flames, her hands clenched in her lap. When Mrs. Granger knocked and entered a moment later, she found her there, silent, unmoving. The older woman said nothing for a long moment, then sat beside her and sighed. "You may be stitching curtains for a palace girl," she said gently, "but you're still standing in the rain." Margaret turned her head slowly. "The palace is leaking," she murmured. Mrs. Granger placed a warm hand over hers. "And the storm is just beginning." Outside, the fog had returned, but it no longer whispered. It pressed its weight against the windows like a secret too heavy to carry alone. The rain began at dusk. It came first as a whisper, fine droplets that kissed the rooftops and courtyards of Sydney like shy confessions. By the time Margaret Fairchild reached Clarendon Terrace, the whisper had become a voice, persistent and cold, sliding along the gutters and drumming softly against the windows of the city's grandest homes. She stood beneath the stone arch of number 7, her cloak clinging damply to her shoulders, a parcel tucked beneath her arm, and her gloves chilled through. The glow of gaslight from within spilled in golden pools onto the front steps. But still she hesitated before lifting the brass knocker. Something inside her pulsed in quiet defiance of habit, as if part of her had learned to fear warmth when it came too freely. The door opened not a moment after she knocked. It was not the footman this time, but a housemaid with downcast eyes and hurried movements. "You may wait in the west drawing-room," the girl said without ceremony, already turning. "Mr. Kerrigan is not yet returned from his meeting." Margaret stepped inside, brushing rain from her shoulders as she moved through the hall she now knew well. Its silence was thick tonight, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The west drawing-room was dimly lit, the fire reduced to glowing embers. A porcelain clock ticked faintly on the mantel. Margaret placed her parcel, 2 repaired coats and a set of evening gloves, on the sideboard, then removed her wet gloves and folded them neatly. She waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The wind outside shifted, sending a low moan down the chimney. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked. Her eyes drifted toward the shadows beyond the open door, to the long hallway she had walked only once before. Her heart stirred with unease, and something else, curiosity perhaps, or the echo of a moment half remembered. Her feet moved before she gave them permission. She passed the library and the dining hall, arriving at a set of doors she recognized by the carved lilies at their corners. One stood slightly ajar. The space beyond was dim, but not empty. A pianoforte waited in the far corner, draped in velvet. Heavy curtains were drawn over the windows, and the faint smell of lavender and polished wood lingered in the air. Margaret stepped inside, drawn not by impulse, but by something slower, heavier, a sense of presence, of breath suspended in time. She approached the pianoforte and noticed the sheet music still resting on the stand. The ink had faded along the edges, the paper curling slightly with age. The title, written in a delicate hand, read, "For Rebecca." The name struck like a bell. Her hand hovered above the keys, not to play but to feel. The ivory was smooth and cold beneath her fingertips, like the wrist of a sleeping child. She heard the door behind her before she saw him. Nathaniel Kerrigan stood in the threshold, his coat removed, his shirt damp at the collar from the rain, his hair slightly tousled, his gaze fixed on her, unreadable. "You weren't expected in that room," he said quietly, his voice neither sharp nor kind, just controlled. Margaret drew back from the instrument. "My apologies," she murmured. "The maid left me waiting. I didn't mean to intrude." For a moment the air hung thick between them. Then, slowly, his shoulders relaxed. "No one comes in here anymore," he said, stepping fully into the room. "Not even the staff." Margaret lowered her eyes, her voice gentle. "It feels like someone still does." He walked toward the pianoforte, brushing his fingers across the back of the bench. "She used to play every evening, always something soft. Never performed, just played." The way he said she carried a gravity that needed no further explanation. "She was your wife," Margaret said softly. He nodded once, still facing the instrument. "She died while I was at sea," he said. "I had left on business for Port Darwin. When I returned, it was already over. Fever. She deteriorated within days. There was no time." The silence that followed was not empty, it was brimming. With regret, with guilt, with the weight of words too long unsaid. Margaret stood still, her eyes on the man rather than the portrait behind him. "I'm sorry," she said. He turned to her, and something in his gaze shifted. The mask, always so perfectly held, cracked just enough to let her see the ache beneath it. "There are nights," he said, his voice low, "when I wake expecting to hear her music, and when I don't, I feel the silence more than I ever felt the sound." Margaret stepped closer, not toward the pianoforte, but toward him. "We don't stop hearing the voices of those we lose," she said. "We only become better at pretending we don't." Nathaniel's breath caught. He looked at her, really looked, and the space between them became a thread stretched taut, fragile, invisible, humming with everything neither dared say aloud. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the harbor. He gestured toward the corridor. "Would you take tea?" Margaret hesitated. It was a simple question, harmless on its surface, but beneath it, under the calm tone and polite offer, lurked something else, a shifting, unspoken awareness that something between them had turned a corner neither of them had prepared for. She should have said no. She should have offered a curtsy and fled into the rain and the safety of familiarity, but she didn't. "I should return to the shop," she said. Her voice trembled only once, near the end of the sentence. Not from fear, but from the refusal. She wasn't sure she believed herself. He nodded slowly. Of course. He did not press. She turned toward the door but did not move. Her hand rested lightly on the frame, her back half turned. His eyes remained on her. Outside, the storm deepened, wind now rushing against the shutters like the breath of something wild. Candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the floor between them. Margaret stood at the threshold, motionless. She could feel his gaze on the curve of her shoulder, the line of her neck, not in hunger but in recognition, as though he had found something he had long forgotten he was looking for. When she finally stepped away, she did not look back, but he followed her with his eyes until the shadows swallowed her. Moments later, outside the Kerrigan residence, a man stood in the shelter of a narrow alley, his coat turned up against the rain. He held a damp notebook in one hand and a folded broadsheet in the other. His eyes were fixed on the warm windows of number 7. He jotted a few words with a pencil already dulled by overuse. He did not need to sign his notes. His employer would recognize the handwriting and pay him well for it. Twilight descended upon Sydney like a veil woven from whispers and smoke. The lamps had just begun to glow along the main roads, their golden halos flickering in protest against the deepening dusk. The city, in its elegant facades and shadowed alleyways, braced itself for the hush that came only after supper, when secrets stirred and eyes watched from behind drawn curtains. From the far side of Clarendon Terrace, 2 silhouettes stood beneath the wrought-iron arch of number 7. One, tall, composed, unmistakably male, remained in the doorway. The other, cloaked with her bonnet low and her parcel held close to her chest, stepped down the final stair, pausing just a moment before entering the thickening fog. Margaret Fairchild did not see the figure across the street, but he saw her. From the safety of a carriage's shadow, a man pressed the stub of his pencil against the moist page of his notebook. He did not write yet. He waited for the moment when the light from the Kerrigan windows caught the edge of her cheek, the modest line of her jaw, the unmistakable softness of a woman departing a man's home after dusk. There it was. He scribbled 4 words, slow and deliberate. She left at 7. The scandal did not break the next morning. It breathed into existence, whispered from house to house, murmured across tea tables, trickled from gloved hand to gloved hand like ink spilled slowly across the city's finest linen. By the second afternoon, Mrs. Granger had already heard 3 different versions. In one, Margaret had been invited to play the pianoforte at an intimate gathering and had overstayed her welcome. In another, she had arrived without being summoned and had to be escorted from the premises. The most vicious claimed she had been seen through the window, her silhouette framed by candlelight, standing too close to the master of the house. Wolves in corsets, the lot of them. Mrs. Granger spat as she stirred the evening stew. Their own husbands haven't touched them in years, but they'd burn you at the stake for brushing elbows with a gentleman after sunset. Margaret sat quietly at the small kitchen table, her hands folded around a chipped porcelain cup. She said nothing, not because she was without words, but because she knew that none would shield her now. Sydney, like all cities ruled by old money and fresh ambition, devoured the dignified and the voiceless with equal hunger. She had not touched Nathaniel, not with her hands, but they had stood too long in that quiet music room, sharing a silence too heavy to ignore. She had stepped away, yes, but not before something between them had shifted, and someone had seen. By the 3rd day, it reached the Kerrigan offices. Nathaniel stood by the wide-paned window of his harbour-facing study when Mr. Beckford arrived unannounced. The older man wore a fine coat of grey wool, his gloves stitched with monograms, his brow furrowed as if he had aged a decade since their last meeting. "I've come regarding the tea shipment to Calcutta," Beckford said, voice tight. Nathaniel turned slowly, his posture calm, though something behind his eyes had gone cold. "It left port yesterday." Beckford hesitated. "I wish to withdraw my investment." Nathaniel said nothing at first. Then, with quiet finality, he asked, "And what, may I ask, changed your position overnight?" Beckford cleared his throat. "There is talk, unfortunate talk. I am a family man, Kerrigan. My name is tied to yours through contract. I cannot be seen supporting impropriety, especially domestic impropriety." The word domestic hung between them like a blade. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You mean Miss Fairchild?" "I mean the perception, regardless of truth," Beckford answered, eyes lowering. "It would be wise to avoid further proximity, for your sake and hers." He left without waiting for reply. That evening, Margaret arrived at the Kerrigan residence to deliver the newly completed silk cravat he had requested. She stood in the hallway, tall, composed, with her parcel held like a shield, and waited as a footman disappeared to announce her presence. Nathaniel did not come. After nearly 10 minutes, he emerged. His face was unreadable, his movements precise. "You came in person," he said coolly. "You asked for the piece by hand," she replied. "You could have sent your assistant." "I have none." A beat of silence. Then, with no preamble, "Have you been speaking about me?" The words landed like a slap, not in volume, but in weight. Margaret blinked. "To whom would I speak?" "There are whispers," he said, "at the harbour, in the streets. My clients have heard them." "My investors," her voice remained steady. "And you believe I started them? I'm asking if you repeated anything of what you've seen in this house." She did not answer with words. Instead, she stepped forward, placing the parcel on the table between them. Her eyes, usually gentle, now flamed with wounded pride. "I have never spoken your name aloud where it wasn't required. I have defended you without being asked. And still, I am the one dragged through mud." He stared at her. She took a breath. "I came here tonight not to ask for your protection, but to uphold my end of a bargain. Your garments are complete. My dignity, however, is not." She turned on her heel and left, the door closing softly behind her. Rain began again that night. It came in sheets, carried sideways by wind that rattled window panes and bent branches low. Margaret arrived home soaked to the bone, her bonnet heavy with water, her boots caked with street mud. Mrs. Granger was asleep, a shawl over her lap, a half-mended stocking dangling from her chair. Upstairs, Margaret pushed open her chamber door and stopped. Her breath caught. The room was not as she had left it. Her sewing box lay overturned, spools of thread scattered like entrails across the floor. The drawers of her writing desk had been pulled out and dumped. Her dresses, every one of them, had been torn from the wardrobe and slashed, their bodices cut through, their hems ripped and trailing. The mirror above the fireplace had been cracked straight down the center, and on the wall, written in crude, smeared strokes of coal, were 3 words: "Know your place." Her knees weakened. She stepped forward, the boards creaking beneath her feet, her eyes fixed on the message. At the edge of the window, open just an inch, the curtain fluttered weakly in the breeze. On the cobblestones below, in the glow of the lamplight, something flickered. A cigar burned slowly in the rain, its embers fading. Margaret closed the window with trembling hands and bolted it tight. She did not cry. She began quietly and without a word to pick up the pieces, thread by thread, dress by dress. As the storm raged outside, she lit a candle against the dark and sat in silence. The city could take her name. It would not take her hands. The sky was still the color of ash when Nathaniel Kerrigan stepped out of his carriage, his boots striking the wet stones with purposeful weight. Fog clung low to the ground, like breath exhaled from the lungs of the earth. Above, the city had not yet stirred. Only the sound of distant waves and the shrill cry of a morning gull announced the hour. He climbed the narrow steps to the seamstress's shop with a heart that beat harder than it should have. He had not slept. Not truly. Not since Beckford's withdrawal. Not since the insinuations whispered behind gloved hands had gained traction. Not since he had accused her. He had tried to dismiss the image from his mind, the look in her eyes when she left him standing in the hall, the hurt buried beneath her composure, but the image returned again and again, like a melody without end. The door was unlatched. He stepped inside. The shop was dark, lit only by a dying lantern and the first fingers of dawn through the curtain seams. And there, on her knees amidst the wreckage, was Margaret Fairchild. Her hair had come loose from its pins, curling softly against her neck. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing bruises on her forearms, likely from lifting the overturned chest of drawers now standing half right beside her. Her dress was soot-streaked and torn near the hem, yet her face bore no tears, only silence. She did not hear him at first. He moved closer, slowly, as if approaching something sacred or dangerous, or both. Margaret. She froze. Then she looked up, and for the briefest moment her eyes betrayed something raw. But it passed, and she sat back on her heels. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low. "I wasn't expecting anyone. There's little to see." His gaze swept the room, the broken furniture, the slashed garments. The words scrawled on the wall, now partially scrubbed, but still legible in the gloom. "Know your place." He felt a coldness stir inside him. "Did you report it?" "To whom?" she asked. "A constable who sees a widow with unpaid debts and a ruined reputation? Or one who works for Blackthorne behind closed doors?" His hands curled into fists. "I'll see to it," he said. She shook her head and reached for a shattered picture frame, placing its fragments into a sack. "Do not make this about vengeance." He knelt beside her. "I'm not here for vengeance." Their eyes met. The silence between them was full again, of things unsaid, of grief, of a mutual knowing that defied their stations and their scars. "I can't leave it like this," she whispered. "It must be cleaned, restored, even if no one sees. You needn't stay here tonight." "I have nowhere else." He paused. "Then come with me." She blinked. "Not as a worker, not as a seamstress." Her breath caught. "As what, then?" "As someone I wronged," he said quietly, "and do not wish to wrong again." The silence returned, deeper now, charged with something neither of them dared name. When she rose, he helped her, and this time she did not pull her hand away. They arrived at number 7, just as the city stirred. The household staff blinked in confusion, but no orders were given, no explanations offered. Margaret was shown to a small chamber on the second floor, warm and simply adorned, overlooking the garden. A maid brought her a basin and a fresh dress, modest in soft cream linen, the sort of garment worn by quiet companions, not hired help. She bathed in silence, dressed and joined Nathaniel in the sunroom. It was there, over a breakfast neither of them touched, that the unspoken shifted into the spoken. Was she kind? Margaret asked suddenly. Nathaniel looked up from his untouched cup. Rebecca. He considered the question for a long time. She was gentle, light. I met her when I believed I would never need more than companionship. I did not yet know what it meant to lose someone slowly, even before they were gone. Margaret nodded once. "I envied that kind of love once," she said. "The effortless kind, the kind that fits like silk." He studied her but said nothing. That evening a meal was served in the red dining room, duck with root vegetables, fresh bread, wine neither of them finished. Conversation flowed differently now, no longer edged with formality. They spoke of memory and soil, of childhood fears and lost laughter, of ships and storms, of music and quiet dreams. Afterward, he led her once again into the music room. The fire had already been lit. The pianoforte waited. She sat without being asked. Her fingers hesitated for only a moment before they pressed the keys. The notes filled the room like light, soft and uncertain at first, then clearer. A melody half-remembered, one she had read days before, for Rebecca. He stood behind her, eyes closed, one hand resting lightly on the back of the bench, not touching her, but near. The music faded, note by note. Silence followed. She turned her face toward him, and what passed between them in that moment had no need of language. It shimmered in the air, delicate and dangerous. He bent slightly, her breath caught. Their faces were close enough now for her to see the flecks of silver at his temples, the small scar near his right brow, the vulnerability in his eyes, barely shielded by pride. He moved a fraction closer, and then she lifted her hand, placed it lightly over his chest. "You do not want me," she whispered. "You want what you lost." He inhaled. Her hand trembled, and slowly she stepped back. He did not argue. He did not plead. He only watched as she turned away, her figure framed by the firelight and shadows. The next morning brought no storm, but something colder still. While Margaret embroidered in the library, a voice echoed in the front hall. Julian Blackthorne. She heard his laughter before she saw him. Then he entered the room without waiting to be announced, all charm and malice dressed in velvet green. My, he drawled. Quite the morning picture. She stood. "I'm here as a guest," she said calmly. "Of course you are." His smile cut through the air like glass. "Just as your husband once was my guest, before he took a swim." Her hand clenched at her side. Julian stepped closer. "I wonder," he said softly, "what it is about this house that draws the drowning." He turned and left with a whistle on his lips. Later that day, folded discreetly into the Colonial Courier, a new column appeared. A sharp, satirical piece titled "The Thread That Unravelled the Merchant." No names were mentioned, but every reader knew: the widow, the ruined shop, the rising merchant brought low by desire. Nathaniel read it in his study. Margaret read it alone, seated near the pianoforte. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the ground shift again, this time not beneath their feet, but beneath the eyes of a city that never truly slept. Sydney wore a shroud of stillness that morning, the kind of silence that follows a storm, not of weather, but of consequence. The city, usually bustling by mid-morning, seemed to hold its breath, aware, perhaps, that something had shifted, though it could not name what. Ships bobbed in the harbour, waiting for cargo or command, and the gulls wheeled overhead without song. Even the bells of St. James rang with less conviction. Inside number 7 Clarendon Terrace, the air was unusually quiet. Servants moved about with more caution than usual, their eyes lowered, their steps light. The Colonial Courier, with its ink still damp from the press, lay unread on the sideboard, its offending column folded and forgotten by no one. In the sewing room on the second floor, Margaret Fairchild pressed the last stitch into the lapel of a new coat. Meant for an evening reception, Nathaniel was due to attend that week. Her fingers moved with precision, but her mind wandered, a leaf floating downstream, unable to resist the current. Her eyes, usually sharp and focused, were distant, clouded by the satirical words still echoing in the corners of her memory. When the coat was folded and wrapped, she took it to the study as instructed, where Nathaniel had said she could leave it on his desk. She entered without knocking. The room was warm, heavy with the scent of tobacco and ink. The large windows faced the harbour, but the curtains had been drawn, muting the light. The desk was cluttered with parchment ledgers, wax seals, and 2 half-open letters. She placed the package gently near the inkstand, meaning to leave as quietly as she had entered. But then she saw it. A cabinet drawer near the fireplace stood slightly ajar, the brass handle glinting in the dim light. A corner of thick parchment jutted out, as though someone had hastily tried to shove it back and failed. She hesitated. She was not a woman given to curiosity where it did not serve her, but something in that drawer whispered. A soft, irresistible pull. She stepped toward it and drew it open just enough to extract the bound book inside. It was a ledger, thicker and more worn than the ones typically used for daily inventory. The ink was darker, the margins smudged. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the columns. Dates, quantities, ports, signatures. Then she frowned. She knew Nathaniel's handwriting well by now. Clean, slanted, efficient. These entries bore his mark, yes, but they didn't match the numbers in the new ledgers she had delivered just days ago. She remembered them clearly. She had pressed a flower between 2 pages to dry. The flower was gone here, and the totals, they didn't match. She flipped through more pages. The numbers had been altered, redistributed, restructured. The pattern was not accidental. Someone had gone to great lengths to make the changes seem logical, even routine. But something was wrong. Very wrong. Her breath caught. "I didn't expect you in here." The voice came from behind her. She turned slowly. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his coat slung over one arm, his expression unreadable. Margaret straightened. "I came to leave your garments." The door was open. The drawer. She held out the ledger, not in guilt, but in quiet alarm. He stepped forward, took it from her hands and opened it. The moment his eyes met the columns, his face darkened. "This isn't the official copy," he muttered. "I know," she said. "The totals aren't the same." He nodded once, slowly. "This ledger," he said carefully, "was kept for backup. Only one other man ever saw it." Margaret did not ask who. "Julian." Nathaniel placed the book on the desk and sat down, running a hand through his hair. "He insisted on a joint inventory last quarter, claimed it would be safer, more transparent. I allowed it." "Foolishly." Margaret moved closer. "What does this mean?" "It means," he said, lifting his eyes to hers, "that someone has been altering records, that someone is trying to dismantle my business from within." "Why?" Nathaniel's gaze was steady, heavy with truth. "Because he does not tolerate what he cannot control." The air between them grew heavier. Margaret reached for the coat she had brought, as though needing to hold something tangible. "Do you trust me?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her. "Yes," she nodded. "Then let me help you fix this." He rose. "You already are." Later that day, as Margaret returned to her room with her sewing basket, she found a letter slipped beneath her chamber door. She froze. The envelope was plain. No seal, no name, only the distinct sour scent of cigar smoke. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the fold and opened the parchment. The message was short. "Leave him, or your husband's drowning becomes public record. You remember the debt. So do I." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Margaret sank slowly into the chair beside the window. Outside, the sun had begun to set, its light painting the glass in streaks of orange and copper. The letter fell from her fingers to her lap. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with fury. She knew the handwriting, the way the loops curved just slightly too high, the pressure marks on the downstrokes. It was the same script as the first debt notice she had received after Edwin's death, the one that had appeared like a ghost in her room, the one that had threatened her livelihood from the shadows. Julian Blackthorne had never truly been in the dark. He had simply waited. She stood and walked to the fireplace, where a small stack of kindling had been laid for the evening fire. She knelt, struck the flint, and lit the corner of the letter. It curled in on itself, the edges blackening, words consumed in silence. She did not watch it burn. Instead, she crossed to her desk and retrieved a small, leather-bound notebook. From inside, she pulled out the first notice, yellowed now with time and the faintest trace of the same smoke. She placed it beside a clean sheet of paper and began to write. Not for the police, not for the press, but for Nathaniel. When she finished, she folded the papers and slipped them into an envelope bearing no seal, only the certainty of truth. Downstairs, the gas lamps flickered to life. The city would soon wake to scandal once more. But Margaret Fairchild would no longer run from shadows, not even her own. The wind that night did not howl, it breathed. It moved through the streets of Sydney with eerie softness, rustling the branches of the trees along Macquarie Place and curling beneath the shutters of homes already sealed against the cold. The harbour, so often alive with the chorus of creaking ropes and shouting sailors, was eerily quiet, as though the city itself had paused to listen for something it could not yet name. Inside the modest kitchen of a boarding house on Argyle Street, Mrs. Tabitha Granger sat at her small table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Her eyes were fixed not on the flickering hearth, but on Margaret, who stood silently across from her, the letter still clutched in her hand. "It's time," Margaret said at last. "You know it is." Tabitha lowered her gaze, but not in refusal. "I should have told you years ago." "Then tell me now." The older woman inhaled slowly, as if summoning breath from a place she had buried long ago. "It was early spring," she began, her voice rough. "Your Edwin had come home late, muddy from the docks, his coat wet through. He didn't see me. I was mending socks by the parlour door when he stormed into the back room. He wasn't alone." Margaret's fingers tightened around the letter. "It was Julian Blackthorne," Tabitha continued. "I recognized his voice. Oily as ever, all charm and poison." She took a slow sip of her tea, then set the cup down. "Edwin was desperate. Something about a shipment lost en route to Calcutta. Said he could repay every penny if given time, begged him, said he had a wife to care for. Blackthorne only laughed, said time was the one thing a debtor could never afford." Margaret's breath caught. "And then he left, just like that. And a week later, they found Edwin in the harbour." "No bruises," Margaret murmured. "No blood, just stillness." Mrs. Granger nodded. "No one saw him fall. No one saw him struggle. It was as if he simply walked into the water and let it take him." Silence thickened between them. "He was scared," Margaret said softly. "I remember that. His sleep grew restless. He would wake and pace. But he wouldn't tell me why." Tabitha reached across the table, laying her worn hand atop Margaret's. "Because he thought he could protect you, even if it meant going alone." Margaret stood suddenly. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She merely said, "Then it's my turn now." That afternoon, she dressed in grey wool, tied her bonnet with quiet hands, and walked through the city's centre with the calm of a woman who no longer feared what others would say. She found Julian Blackthorne in his usual haunt, a gentleman's club on Hunter Street where cigars smoked thick in the air and crystal decanters clinked with amber liquor. He saw her before she spoke and smiled. "Well, well," he drawled, rising from his chair with mock civility. "If it isn't the widow with such excellent timing. Come to sew me a shroud?" She didn't flinch. "I want the truth." "Do you?" He stepped closer. "Or do you only want to be lied to with greater care?" Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out the first debt notice, the one with the same handwriting as the letter slipped beneath her door. "I kept it," she said, "not out of fear, out of instinct." Julian took it, barely glancing before setting it aside. "You always were neat," he said. "Too neat for your own good. Did you kill him?" Julian laughed. "I don't kill people, Margaret." He leaned in closer, his breath tinged with port. "I just opened the door and let the sea decide." She stared at him, horror and clarity crashing together in the pit of her stomach. "You threatened him." "I gave him a choice," he said coolly. "The same I've offered you." He brushed imaginary lint from his cuff. "Some people are not meant to swim, my dear." Margaret turned and left without another word, her pulse hammering in her ears. That evening she found Nathaniel in the library, a decanter of brandy, half full and untouched, on the table beside him. He looked up as she entered, his brow furrowed. "You're pale," he said. "I spoke to Julian." He straightened. "Alone." He confirmed everything. The debt, the threats, my husband's fear, his silence. Nathaniel stood. "You have proof?" Margaret shook her head. Only words. His voice is a blade he wields in the shadows. Nathaniel paced the length of the room. The fire cast gold across his face, sharpening the tension in his jaw. Without proof, I can't take him to court. I know. But you believe me? He turned to her then, and something in his face softened. Of course I do. Later that night, Margaret could not sleep. She wandered the halls of the house, her bare feet silent on the rug, her mind a storm of memory and warning. She found herself in the music room, the pianoforte closed, the fire dying low. She sat without lighting a candle, letting the shadows gather, and then she smelled it. Smoke, not the gentle smoke of hearth fires. This was harsher, stronger, alive. A moment later, a maid screamed. Margaret ran. Nathaniel was already at the stairs, his coat half done, barking orders to the house staff. "The warehouse," he said, grabbing her by the arm. "Stay here. I'm coming with you." They arrived at the docks to find Kerrigan's warehouse engulfed in flame. The sky was red with fury, the scent of burning timber and spices thick in the air. Men formed lines to douse the fire, but the blaze was hungry. Nathaniel surged forward, shouting orders, ignoring the heat as he pulled crates away from the building. Margaret caught sight of a beam falling just behind him. He barely dodged it. Smoke billowed, swallowing the shape of his body. "Nathaniel!" She rushed forward but was held back. It took nearly an hour to contain the fire. When they finally pulled him from the wreckage, his coat was singed, his hands blistered, and his right shoulder bore a fresh burn across the fabric. He did not cry out. He only asked hoarsely, "Is she safe?" Margaret fell to her knees beside him, pressing her forehead to his hand. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But you're my fool." The following morning, Sydney awoke to headlines. Flames at the docks, Kerrigan's fortune up in smoke. And beneath that, smaller, crueler, the widow's curse. Is misfortune the price of forbidden affection? Whispers no longer lingered in alleyways. They danced on paper, inked for all to see, but Margaret no longer bowed her head. She stood beside Nathaniel as he walked through the wreckage, shoulder bandaged, clothes dark with ash. And when they reached the edge of the ruin, she took his hand, not in secret, not in shame. They looked out over the harbour together, the water that had once taken her husband, the fire that had tried to consume their future, and in between, the truth, at last, no longer hidden. The courthouse on King Street had never seen such a crowd. Even before the sun cleared the harbour's haze, the steps were lined with gawkers, gossip-mongers and gentlemen in silk waistcoats, their faces bright with morbid curiosity. The trial was not merely legal, it was social. The fall of a man like Julian Blackthorne, or the vindication of a woman like Margaret Fairchild, was fodder not just for justice, but for legend. Inside, the air pulsed with the hum of scandal. Reporters sharpened their pencils like blades. Women in feathered bonnets leaned toward one another, their whispers trailing like perfume. And high above it all, beneath the carved arch of the judge's bench, a silence settled thick and unforgiving. Nathaniel Kerrigan sat at the plaintiff's table, straight-backed, dressed in a simple dark suit, no gold watch, no polished boots, just dignity worn like armor. The skin at his temple was still pink from the warehouse fire. He made no attempt to conceal it. At his side, Barrister Alden Travers sorted through the evidence with precise fingers. The Kerrigan name, once synonymous with strength and shipping, now trembled on the edge of ruin. And yet Nathaniel's gaze never wavered. Across from him, Julian Blackthorne lounged like a man at a garden party. His waistcoat shimmered faintly beneath his coat, his cravat perfectly tied. His smile, idle and amused, curled with the arrogance of one who had bought his way out of trouble many times before. When the bailiff called the court to order, Margaret sat in the back, unseen but not unnoticed. She wore navy blue, modest and tailored, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Her presence was whispered from bench to bench, some with disdain, others with grudging awe. The The proceedings began. First came the formalities, ownership records, shipment manifests, contracts reviewed and signed. Then came the twisted threadwork of lies. Blackthorn's counsel, a silver-haired man with a voice like syrup, painted Nathaniel as unstable and rash, claiming that his business losses had clouded his better judgment. He called witnesses, men in expensive coats who claimed Julian was abroad during the disputed shipment. None of them met Margaret's eyes. And then the knives came out. She, the defense sneered, is the widow of a man who drowned himself in debt. She was evicted from her home. She was seen entering Mr. Kerrigan's residence after dark on multiple occasions. Let us not pretend she is impartial. Margaret's breath caught. The room shifted like a ship in storm. Nathaniel stood, slowly, deliberately. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but ironclad, "I call Margaret Fairchild to testify." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you certain?" "I am." A murmur rose. It felt like weather changing. Margaret rose from her seat. She moved not as a victim, but as a force that had waited too long in silence. As she passed the rows of smirking mouths and narrowed eyes, her back remained straight. Not one word could bend her now. She took the stand. The court clerk swore her in. Her voice did not tremble. Nathaniel's counsel approached, but Margaret raised a hand. "I will speak for myself." The judge blinked. "You may proceed, Mrs. Fairchild." She removed from her bag a leather-bound ledger, its edges scorched from the fire but still legible. She placed it on the table before her. "This is the Kerrigan shipping ledger. It contains 2 pages written by someone other than Mr. Kerrigan. The numbers were altered to conceal losses from a joint shipment, losses that were not accidental." Blackthorn leaned back, arms crossed. Margaret turned to the judge. "But that is not why I came here." She reached into her bag once more and unfolded a letter. Its paper was creased, worn, familiar. "This," she said, "is the final debt notice addressed to my late husband, Edwin Fairchild. It bears the same handwriting as the forged entries in the ledger." The courtroom stirred. Margaret's voice did not rise, but it carried, past the wooden beams, past the marble columns, into every listening ear. "My husband did not die because he failed. He died because he was pushed by shame, by fear, by a man who trades in silence, in secrets, in shadows." She looked directly at Julian. "You silence women with shame," she said, "but I am no longer afraid to be seen." Julian's expression cracked for the first time. He shifted in his seat. The judge called for quiet. Outside, church bells struck 12. Inside, time held its breath. The defense attempted to discredit her, called her a grieving woman confused by grief. But it was too late. The letters were examined, the ledger reviewed. A handwriting analyst, called by Nathaniel's counsel, confirmed the match. By the end of the second day, the gallery no longer whispered about Margaret's virtue. They whispered about Julian's ruin. On the third morning, the judge issued his ruling. "In light of the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of Mr. Kerrigan. Mr. Blackthorn's dealings are hereby declared fraudulent, and he is ordered to pay damages. Furthermore, this matter shall be reported to the Colonial Trading Authority for further inquiry." Julian did not speak. He did not bow. He simply rose, turned, and walked out of the courtroom as though nothing had been said. But even from behind he looked smaller. The trial was over, but the city would not forget. Margaret stepped out into the light of afternoon, the air thick with the scent of ink and carriage dust. A boy from the Sydney Gazette held up the latest edition. "Trial of shame. Kerrigan vindicated. Blackthorn's empire crumbles." She passed beneath the headline without pausing. In the weeks that followed, Kerrigan Shipping struggled. Clients withdrew. Contracts dissolved. The warehouse remained in ashes. Nathaniel's name, once spoken with respect, became a matter of polite discomfort at dinner parties. But his dignity remained whole. And Margaret became something else entirely. Some called her the widow who dared. Some called her dangerous. Others quietly began to admire her. She still walked the same streets, still threaded the same needles. But when she passed now, people moved aside, not out of scorn, but out of recognition. One afternoon, a young girl knocked at her shop door, her dress torn, her eyes red from crying. "My mistress said I shouldn't come," the girl whispered. "But I heard what you said in court. I want you to make my wedding gown." Margaret took the girl's hand, and for the first time in months she smiled without armor. She was not saved. She was seen, and that, at last, was enough. The rain had passed. It left behind a city freshly scrubbed, as if the slate of Sydney had been washed clean overnight. The cobblestones on Argyle Street glistened, their edges catching the morning light. The scent of wet earth mingled with fresh bread from the bakery below Margaret's window. The world was unchanged, and yet entirely different. Inside the seamstress shop, the small iron stove glowed, faint but steady. Rolls of fabric lay half unfurled across the work table, seafoam taffeta, buttercream silk, and a spool of crimson thread that Margaret had once considered too bold for her clients. Now it sat at the center of her table, unapologetic. She sat in her usual chair, but her posture had shifted, not stiffer, calmer. No longer waiting for the next blow, the next whisper, the next letter slid beneath her door. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind wandered, not to fear or worry, but to what could come next. The bell above the door rang. She looked up, expecting Mrs. Alcott or one of the Harper sisters, who now vied for her attention with the delicate frenzy of debutantes discovering their own spines. But it was neither of them. It was Nathaniel Kerrigan. He stood in the doorway like a man stripped of his title, but not his purpose. His coat was worn, unbuttoned at the top. No cravat, no gloves, no polished cane. His boots bore the dirt of the quay. His hair, once so precisely combed, curled slightly at the temples from the sea air. And in his hand he held nothing. No proposal, no papers, no contract, only himself. Margaret's needle paused mid-stitch. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. A carriage passed in the street. Somewhere in the building, Mrs. Granger banged a broom against the floor. Then, quietly, Margaret set the needle down. He approached the table, his gaze sweeping over the fabrics, as if seeing them for the first time, not as commodities, but as invitations, as stories waiting to be sown. "I heard," he said, voice low, "that you're no longer accepting walk-ins." Margaret tilted her head, lips curving just slightly. "Only those with scandalous reputations and a flair for reckless business decisions." His mouth twitched. "Then I may qualify." She waited. He took a breath, not nervous, but deliberate. Every word he spoke felt chosen, as if shaped by nights spent thinking of her and days spent wishing he'd said it sooner. "I dissolved Kerrigan Shipping," he said. "The ledgers, the ships, the contracts, all of it. I signed the final papers yesterday." Margaret's brows lifted, but she said nothing. "I don't want to build an empire anymore," he continued. "Not one that requires silence or sacrifice or forgetting who you are to survive it." He reached into his coat pocket, not for a ring, but for something far more vulnerable, a folded piece of paper, plain and unadorned. She took it gently and unfolded it. At the top, Fairchild and Kerrigan, fine tailoring and trade. Below that, a modest list of values: equal partnership, ethical sourcing, apprenticeships for working women, and a warehouse that doubled as a trade hall and design space. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she held it. "You could have just asked me to marry you," she said quietly. He met her eyes. "I would have, but then I remembered what you said. You don't need saving." "I don't," he nodded. "But I'd like to walk beside you, build something not in your name, not in mine, in both." Margaret exhaled slowly, a breath that felt as if it had been held for years. She placed the paper on the table. "There's only one condition," she said. "I'm listening." Her voice softened. "Love me. without needing to save me. Silence fell, but it was not empty. It was full of storms survived, of words unspoken, of nights spent listening to the sea instead of sleeping. "I can do that," he said, and she believed him. Later that afternoon they walked together through the rocks, down past the harbour where the wind danced between masts and gulls, circled like distant memories. The salt clung to their skin, but neither of them minded. When they reached the edge of the dock, where once Margaret had stood alone and Nathaniel had only watched from afar, they stopped. The harbour stretched before them, bustling, indifferent, alive. A merchant vessel prepared to sail eastward, its sails rising slowly, like the breath of a beast stirring from slumber. On the dock, crates were loaded, ropes coiled, orders barked, but they heard none of it. Margaret turned to him. "I used to think," she said, "that love came with locks, that if I let anyone in, I'd lose myself." He didn't answer. He only looked at her the way men look at things they don't believe they deserve. She stepped closer. "But with you," she said, "I don't feel small or hidden. I feel real." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, not possessive, not desperate, grateful. Their foreheads touched, and for a long, breathless moment there was nothing between them but the hum of the sea and the sound of their own hearts, remembering how to trust. When their lips met, it was not feverish or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, the kind of kiss that speaks not of passion unbound, but of lives slowly stitched together after being torn apart. Behind them, the ship began to pull away from the dock, its hull cut through the water with purpose, leaving ripples behind, like a signature in the sea. Margaret turned to watch it, Nathaniel's arm now around her waist, solid and sure. The sails caught the wind, crates of wool, silk, and spices bound for another shore, letters sealed in wax, promises tucked into corners of ledgers and hearts. And with each creak of the wood and rush of the tide, something else departed too. The shame, the silence, the city's hold. The sun began to sink behind them, gilding the water in gold. Its last light reached the hem of Margaret's gown, catching the crimson thread still clinging to the fabric. In the hush that followed, a voice, quiet and eternal, seemed to speak from the very stones beneath their feet. In a city built by chains, they chose to bind themselves with love, and that, at last, was freedom. Sydney, May 1860. The sky above the harbour was a pale blue silk, embroidered with the golden thread of a soft autumn sun. Time had passed like the tide, sometimes gentle, sometimes ruthless, but always forward. On the western edge of Lower George Street, a new storefront had replaced the old seamstress shop. Its windows were wide, trimmed in dark wood and etched with gold lettering that gleamed even under overcast skies. Fairchild and Kerrigan, fine tailoring and trade established, 1856. Inside, bolts of imported cloth shared space with ledgers, sketches, teacups, and a small pair of muddy boots abandoned near the entrance. The shop no longer belonged to one world or another. It had become its own, a bridge between trade and art, male and female, past and future. At the back of the shop, a woman stood with a measuring tape draped around her neck. Her hair, darker now and streaked with silver at the temples, was pulled into a low, practical knot. She wore a slate-blue gown with rolled sleeves and ink on her fingers. She had not grown softer with time, only more certain, Margaret Fairchild Kerrigan. From the side room came the sound of a child's laughter, sweet, high, free. "Careful with the chalk, Evie," Margaret called, smiling as she wiped her hands. A girl of 3 tumbled into the doorway, her curls escaping their ribbons, cheeks flushed with joy and chalk dust. In her tiny hands she clutched a swatch of emerald velvet. Her name was Evelyn Rebecca Kerrigan, and she had inherited her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. The child had a habit of calling silk sky cloth and asking if the harbour could carry dreams on its waves. Margaret crouched to pick her up, pressing a kiss to the girl's brow. "You, my love," she whispered, "are not supposed to be in the client room." "But I was making a cape," Evelyn said solemnly, "for Papa." From the office behind them, a man stepped into the frame. Nathaniel Kerrigan, 4 years older, a touch softer at the edges but still tall, composed and marked by the kind of quiet strength one only earns through loss and rebuilding. "No cape needed," he said, sweeping the child into his arms. "Your mother already made me into a better man." Evelyn giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck. The bell above the door rang, and in came Mrs. Granger, a basket on her hip and a conspiratorial smile in her eyes. Age had crept into her joints, but not into her voice. She still ruled her tenants with the sharpness of a needlepoint and the heart of a lioness. "I see our little Duchess is loose again," she quipped. "She's taken over the velvet." Margaret sighed fondly. "Well, better velvet than vinegar. Speaking of which, Mr. Blackthorne passed through the rocks yesterday. Limping now, they say. Lost most of his holdings to that younger brother of his. A man like that never knew when to leave the game." Margaret did not answer. She simply nodded once, then returned to folding the swatches on the table. Some wounds didn't need revisiting. Justice, once served, had no taste for gloating. As Mrs. Granger left, Evelyn waved from her father's arms. "Bye, Mrs. G." Outside, the city had changed. Slowly, unevenly. The court's ruling had inspired whispers in Parliament, talks of tightening trade ethics, of allowing women to testify in their own right, of holding power to account not only by wealth, but by character. The voices were still faint, still too few, but they were there. Some clients had abandoned Margaret after the scandal, but others had come in their place. Women who owned land, widows who refused to fade, men who believed a tailor's worth was in their stitch, not their surname. A small apprenticeship program now lived above the shop where girls once sent to mend linens were taught to draft patterns, read books, and speak in their own names. Not all battles were won, but the war against silence had taken a blow. That evening, after the shop was closed and Evelyn had fallen asleep with pins stuck into a cushion she called her button baby, Margaret stood with Nathaniel on the dock where it had all begun. The sea was dark and glassy. In the distance, a freighter bearing their name, the Fairchild, pulled into the harbour. It did not carry coal or tobacco. It carried fabrics, tapestries and letters from clients in Singapore, Port Louis and Calcutta. Trade had not ended for them. It had simply changed its shape. Nathaniel placed a hand on the small of Margaret's back. "You once said, 'Love should not come to save,'" he murmured. She nodded, eyes on the ship. "I still believe that. And yet," he added, "I think it did save us. Not from each other, but from who we were before we found each other." She turned to him, and in that glance was everything. Storms endured, silences broken, names reclaimed. "Then let's never be who we were," she said. "Let's always choose who we are becoming." The tide lapped softly at the pilings. Behind them, the city breathed and blinked and murmured on, filled with letters unwritten, hands unheld, dreams deferred. But for Margaret and Nathaniel, the world had already shifted, not into perfection, but into possibility. And as the stars emerged, timid and silver, a voice seemed to echo over the water once more. "Love always finds a way, even in silence, even in ruin, even after the last page is turned." And so ends the story of Margaret and Nathaniel. A tale born from ashes, stitched with silence, and finished in the colours of courage and love. This was never just a romance, it was a reminder that dignity is not inherited, it is claimed. That love, when honest, does not rescue, it recognizes, and that even in a world built to silence certain voices, the truth eventually finds its way to the light. If you stayed with us until the very end, we invite you to leave the word "thread" in the comments. It's our secret way of knowing who felt every stitch of this story with us. What did you feel while watching this? Did you see yourself in Margaret, in Nathaniel, in the quiet strength it takes to begin again? If this story moved you even a little, consider leaving a super thanks to support the small, passionate team that brings these narratives to life. Any amount, truly any, is deeply appreciated and helps us continue to craft stories that touch the heart. And if a financial contribution isn't possible right now, your voice is just as powerful. Share this video with a friend who loves period dramas. Send it to someone who needs a reminder that resilience can be soft and strength can be stitched in silence. You'll find links to similar stories in the cards above. We think you'll fall in love with them too. Thank you for watching, thank you for feeling, and remember, love always finds a way.